Beneath the endless forests of Central America lies a world that was hidden for centuries. Ancient roads stretch beneath the trees, enormous cities rise under the canopy, and entire landscapes once filled with farms, reservoirs, temples, and thousands of homes have almost disappeared from sight. Now, new technology is revealing just how vast this forgotten Maya world really was, and the discoveries are changing what we thought we knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy uncovering the mysteries of the ancient world. From above, the forest seems almost endless. A green ocean stretches across northern Guatemala and neighboring parts of Central America, broken only by the occasional ridge-just river or pale stone summit rising through the canopy. From the ground, the impression is even stronger. Trees crowd together so tightly that sunlight reaches the forest floor in fragments. Roots push through old masonry. Vines hang across collapsed walls. Insects fill the humid air with a constant mechanical hum, while leaves, mud, and centuries of falling debris conceal almost everything that once stood here. It is easy to believe that this landscape has always been wilderness. For generations, that assumption shaped the way outsiders imagined the ancient Maya world, a scattering of impressive ceremonial cities surrounded by vast stretches of mostly empty jungle. Then the forest began to disappear without a single tree being cut down. Aircraft carrying laser scanners passed over huge regions of the Maya lowlands and fired pulses of light toward the earth below. Most struck leaves and branches, but enough slipped through gaps in the canopy to reach the ground. When researchers digitally removed the vegetation from the resulting data, an entirely different landscape emerged. Beneath what looked like uninterrupted jungle were platforms, house foundations, terraces, walls, reservoirs, defensive systems, quarries, causeways, and entire settlements that had been almost impossible to see from ground level. The forest had not hidden a handful of isolated ruins. It had hidden the traces of a landscape shaped by millions of human decisions. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The discovery was not that Maya cities existed beneath the trees. Archaeologists had known places such as Tikal, Calakmul, El Mirador, Caracol, and many others for generations, and Maya communities themselves had never needed modern technology to know that ancient structures covered the region. What changed was scale. Once LiDAR began mapping large areas continuously, famous ruins stopped appearing as lonely islands of stone. Around them stretched neighborhoods, smaller centers. Agricultural zones, roads, fortifications, and settlement clusters, features separated by kilometers of dense vegetation, suddenly became visible together on a single digital surface. What had seemed disconnected on the ground began to look like pieces of one vast human-modified environment. That difference matters because tropical forest archaeology is unusually deceptive. In open desert, a wall can remain visible from a great distance. In a dry valley, an abandoned road may survive as a clear line across the earth. In the humid Maya lowlands, vegetation can erase the appearance of architecture remarkably quickly. A low stone platform becomes a gentle mound. A residential compound becomes an irregular rise covered with trees. A causeway disappears beneath soil and roots until someone walks directly over it without realizing what lies below. Even experienced archaeologists can spend years surveying a limited area and still miss features only a short distance away. The forest does not destroy everything. In some ways, it preserves stone extremely well, but it makes the past difficult to see. For a long time, that invisibility encouraged a particular image of Maya civilization. Great temples and palaces seemed to rise dramatically out of empty green space, suggesting cities dominated by ceremonial cores and surrounded by relatively sparse rural populations. Modern research has complicated that picture. Some regions truly were less densely occupied than others, and Maya settlement was never uniform. But the broader pattern is now much harder to dismiss. Large portions of the lowlands were organized, cultivated, connected, and altered on a scale that earlier maps could not fully capture. The surprise becomes greater when one looks beyond the monuments. A pyramid is visually impressive, but a field system may reveal more about how a civilization actually survived. A palace tells archaeologists something about kings. A reservoir says something about thousands of people waiting for rain. Roads reveal movement. Terraces reveal labor invested in soil. Defensive walls reveal fear. Quarry scars reveal construction demands. Small house platforms, repeated across the landscape, reveal the ordinary population whose lives supported everything else. The forest was covering not only royal architecture but infrastructure. That infrastructure had to function in a difficult environment. Much of the Maya lowland region is built on porous limestone. Surface water can be scarce, and rainfall is strongly seasonal. During the wet months, storms can be intense. During the dry season, water can become a matter of survival. Large urban populations could not depend on monumental architecture alone. They required storage systems, managed land, dependable food production, and political arrangements capable of coordinating labor. The impressive skyline of a Maya city was therefore only the visible crest of a much larger system. And yet the scale of that system remains difficult to reconstruct precisely. Scholars still debate population estimates, the intensity of agriculture in different zones, the political relationships between neighboring centers, and how continuously various regions were occupied. LiDAR can reveal the shape of a feature, but it does not automatically reveal its date. A mound visible beneath the forest might belong to one century, while a nearby terrace or wall belongs to another. Archaeologists still need excavation, ceramics, radiocarbon dating, environmental evidence, and inscriptions to establish chronology. The technology does not solve the mystery by itself, it changes where the mystery begins. What survives in the record suggests a world that was both more crowded and more engineered than the romantic image of isolated temples in untouched jungle. Some areas contain dense networks of residential compounds. Others show large causeways crossing low ground or linking monumental centers. In certain regions, defensive works cut across ridges and approaches, implying conflicts severe enough to reshape the terrain. Wetlands bear traces of manipulation. Hillsides preserve terraces. Depressions near urban centers sometimes prove to be reservoirs enlarged or modified to capture seasonal water. Even the apparently natural contours of the forest can carry the imprint of ancient choices. This is what makes the hidden Maya landscape so unsettling in a quiet way. The mystery is not that a civilization somehow vanished without evidence. The evidence is everywhere. The problem is that the forest changed its appearance so completely that generations could walk across human-made ground and see only nature. A tree growing from the summit of a buried wall makes the wall look ancient beyond comprehension, almost geological. A road beneath 2 meters of vegetation no longer looks like a road. Time turns architecture back into landscape. But the people who built these places were not living in a forgotten world. At their height, they occupied one of the most sophisticated cultural regions in the ancient Americas. They raised enormous ceremonial centers, developed complex writing systems, tracked astronomical cycles, maintained long-distance exchange, fought wars, negotiated alliances, and transformed difficult environments into productive landscapes. Their cities were not accidents in the jungle. The jungle came later. And beneath that green canopy, another story waits deeper still. Long before many of the famous classic Maya kingdoms reached their height, communities were already gathering in large settlements, organizing labor on a massive scale, and constructing monumental spaces that force archaeologists to reconsider just how early this forest world began to take shape. Long before the great stone skylines of Tikal and Calakmul rose above the trees, the Maya lowlands were already filling with communities learning how to live inside a landscape that rewarded cooperation and punished mistakes. The beginnings are quieter than the monumental ruins that later define the civilization. There are no towering temples at first, no royal dynasties carved into stone, no vast plazas crowded with ceremony. Instead, there are households, small farming communities, seasonal camps, patches of cleared forest, hearths, storage pits, pottery, tools, and generations of people slowly discovering which parts of the tropical lowlands could support permanent life. The later grandeur of Maya civilization grows from these ordinary experiments. The environment is both generous and unforgiving. Warm temperatures allow long growing seasons, and tropical soils can produce abundant crops when managed carefully. But fertility varies sharply from one place to another. Rain may fall heavily for months and then almost disappear. In many northern and central lowland areas, rivers are limited or absent because water drains quickly through porous limestone. A place that looks lush during the rainy season can become dangerously dry months later. Early communities therefore learn that survival depends not simply on finding water, but on understanding when it arrives, where it collects, and how long it can be stored. Maize gradually becomes central, joined by beans, squash, chili peppers, and other cultivated plants. Farming does not immediately replace hunting, fishing, gathering, and forest management. Instead, families combine different strategies. They cultivate plots near settlements, exploit wetlands and seasonal water sources, gather fruits and useful plants from the forest, hunt deer and smaller animals, and reshape vegetation in ways that may be difficult for modern observers to recognize. The tropical forest around a Maya settlement is not necessarily untouched wilderness. Even very early communities can favor useful tree species, clear selected areas, burn vegetation, and create patterns that blur the line between farming and forest management. As populations grow, the small advantages of particular locations become increasingly important. Elevated ground offers protection from flooding. Depressions may hold seasonal water. Nearby wetlands can provide fertile soils. Access to flint, clay, stone, timber, and trade routes can turn one settlement into a regional focus. Over generations, people return to the same favorable places, rebuild houses on top of earlier houses, enlarge platforms, and create increasingly permanent communities. The ground itself begins to rise beneath them as architecture accumulates layer upon layer. This slow build-up is one of the most revealing aspects of Maya archaeology. A massive later pyramid may conceal the remains of several earlier buildings inside it. A plaza that appears to belong to one grand moment may actually be the product of centuries of resurfacing and expansion. Maya construction often does not erase the past completely. It encloses it. New buildings are raised over old ones, and old sacred spaces are incorporated into larger designs. Archaeologists excavating through a monumental platform can therefore move backward through time, almost like opening nested boxes. By the Middle and Late Preclassic periods, roughly during the first millennium before the Common Era, the scale of some settlements changes dramatically. Communities that once consisted of modest clusters of residences begin constructing formal plazas, raised platforms, ceremonial buildings, and increasingly large public spaces. Certain architectural patterns repeat across distant sites, suggesting shared ideas about ritual, authority, and how important places should be organized. This is not yet the political world familiar from later classic Maya inscriptions, but something fundamental is happening. People are coordinating labor far beyond the needs of individual households. That coordination matters. Building a large platform from stone, soil, and fill requires thousands of person-hours. Materials must be quarried, carried, shaped, and placed. Workers need food and water while construction continues. Someone must organize when labor happens and decide what will be built. Whether these early projects were directed by powerful rulers, collective institutions, ritual specialists, or changing combinations of all three remains debated. The evidence remains incomplete because political authority rarely leaves a simple archaeological signature. Monumental architecture demonstrates organization, but it does not automatically tell archaeologists exactly who controlled it. One of the most striking examples comes from the broader Mirador Basin region of northern Guatemala, where enormous pre-classic centers eventually emerged centuries before the height of many famous classic cities. El Mirador becomes especially important, with gigantic architectural complexes rising from the lowlands. Some structures are so massive that their total volume rivals or exceeds that of much later monuments elsewhere in Mesoamerica. Their presence forces a major revision of the old assumption that Maya society developed gradually from simple villages into sophisticated cities only during the Classic period. Even more surprising are discoveries suggesting that some early Maya communities were already connected through extensive systems of causeways and planned monumental landscapes. The picture is still being refined, and scholars debate how centralized these networks truly were. But the broader implication is difficult to avoid. Complex social organization appears early. Large populations may have been cooperating across significant distances before the emergence of the better documented royal kingdoms of later centuries. Yet monumental growth also creates new vulnerabilities. Every additional household means more mouths to feed. Every enlarged plaza requires more labor. Every reservoir must hold enough water through the dry season. A society that invests heavily in fixed architecture becomes increasingly dependent on the landscape immediately surrounding it. Forests must be cleared for construction and agriculture. Timber is needed for fuel and lime production. Soil fertility must be maintained. Water systems must function. The larger the settlement becomes, the harder it is to simply move away when conditions deteriorate. There is another change occurring beneath the architecture. Society itself is becoming more differentiated. Some burials contain richer offerings than others. Certain households occupy more prominent positions. Public ritual becomes increasingly elaborate. Exotic materials move across long distances, including obsidian, jade, marine shell, and other valued goods that connect inland communities with distant volcanic highlands and coastlines. Access to these materials may help emerging elites display status and cultivate alliances. Still, it would be misleading to imagine a simple march toward kingship. Different Maya regions develop at different speeds, and some communities follow distinct political paths. There is no single moment when villages suddenly become cities, or when equality abruptly gives way to hierarchy. The transformation unfolds over centuries, shaped by local ecology, competition, cooperation, ritual traditions, migration, and the ambitions of particular communities. What becomes clear is that the forest civilization was not born fully formed. It accumulated. One generation raised a platform, another enlarged it. Families returned to the same plazas. Roads became more established. Ritual places gained history. Settlements became landmarks, and landmarks became centers of power. By the time the first truly enormous cities dominate the landscape, they are standing on centuries of human memory. And once those cities begin to rise, the scale changes again. The forest no longer contains scattered communities connected only by occasional exchange. It begins to hold monumental centers whose architecture can be seen from kilometers away, places built not merely to house people, but to organize entire regions around them. As the centuries pass, the lowlands begin to acquire a new kind of horizon. Where earlier communities had raised modest platforms and communal buildings, some centers now expand into monumental landscapes of extraordinary ambition. Great plazas are leveled and resurfaced. Massive platforms are assembled from stone and fill. Pyramidal structures rise above the forest floor, visible from far beyond the settlements clustered around them. These are not isolated acts of construction. They are the physical expression of societies becoming more organized, more hierarchical, and more capable of mobilizing labor on a scale that would have been difficult to imagine only generations earlier. The transformation is especially striking during the late pre-classic period, when centers in northern Guatemala and surrounding regions reach enormous size. El Mirador is one of the most dramatic examples. Its monumental complexes occupy a landscape that today feels remote and almost inaccessible. Yet in antiquity it forms part of a heavily occupied region. The largest constructions are not simply tall buildings placed on open ground. They are enormous artificial platforms supporting groups of temples and ceremonial architecture. Building them requires moving staggering quantities of stone, rubble, plaster, and earth without metal tools, wheeled transport, or draft animals. The achievement is sometimes obscured by the familiarity of Maya pyramids. Photographs reduce them to picturesque ruins rising through trees. But the real engineering challenge begins long before the final stone facade is added. Limestone must be quarried and broken. Fill must be transported in baskets. Surfaces must be shaped and plastered. Wooden beams are needed for construction. Fuel is burned to produce lime plaster, itself an expensive material in terms of labor and forest resources. Each stage depends on people gathering, feeding, organizing, and coordinating other people. Monumentality is therefore not just architecture. It is evidence of social machinery. Some early ceremonial complexes also display carefully repeated arrangements of buildings, raised platforms, elongated structures, plazas, and pyramidal groups appear in patterns that suggest shared concepts about sacred space and community gathering. Archaeologists continue debating exactly how these designs relate to emerging political institutions, but their repetition across different locations implies that people are participating in a broader cultural world. Architecture becomes a language long before many Maya rulers begin recording their dynastic histories in inscriptions. One surprising feature of this early growth is just how planned some settlements appear. Instead of developing only through random accumulation, Major ceremonial areas can show strong alignment, formal geometry, and deliberate orientation. Plazas are not merely spaces left over between buildings. They are created as places where large numbers of people can gather. Processions can move across them. Ritual performances can be observed from surrounding platforms. The placement of architecture controls what people see, where they enter, and how they experience important ceremonies. These shared spaces may have played a crucial role in creating political communities. Before authority becomes permanently associated with named kings and royal dynasties, public construction and ritual can bind together populations scattered across the surrounding countryside. Families who spend most of their lives farming, collecting water, maintaining houses, and working local plots may periodically enter monumental centres, where architecture creates an entirely different sense of scale. Towering buildings make individual people feel small. Wide plazas bring thousands together. Repeated ceremonies create shared memory. Over generations, the city becomes more than a place. It becomes proof that a larger social order exists. But the exact nature of that order remains uncertain. Monumental construction is often interpreted as evidence for powerful elites, and in many cases that interpretation is persuasive. Yet scholars still debate how authority operates during the earlier phases of Maya urbanism. Some large projects may have relied on communal labour organised through ritual obligations rather than direct royal command. Political hierarchy could develop gradually, with leaders gaining influence by coordinating ceremonies, exchange, warfare, or water management. The evidence does not support a single model for every settlement. What does seem clear is that inequality becomes increasingly visible. Certain residential compounds grow larger and more elaborate. High-status burials contain valuable objects, imported jade, obsidian, shell, and other prestigious materials appear in contexts associated with ritual and elite identity. Architecture begins separating spaces more carefully, distinguishing public gathering areas from restricted compounds. The built environment itself starts to reflect differences in status. At the same time, ordinary households remain the foundation of the entire system. Monumental centres cannot survive without surrounding farmers. Maize fields, gardens, orchards, managed forests, and wetlands support the populations gathering in the plazas. Potters produce vessels, stoneworkers make tools, builders shape limestone, hunters and fishers supplement agricultural diets. Traders move goods across long routes. The city is impressive because so much less visible work happens around it. This wider landscape is difficult to appreciate today because the forest makes distance deceptive. Two monumental centres separated by many kilometres may appear isolated when approached on foot, yet ancient travellers could have moved through settled zones, agricultural areas, roadside communities, and raised causeways. Recent remote sensing has made these connections increasingly visible, though dating individual features remains essential. Not everything appearing together on a LiDAR map necessarily existed at exactly the same moment. Still, the accumulating evidence changes the scale of the story. Major Maya centers were not simply ceremonial islands surrounded by untouched wilderness. Many formed parts of densely used landscapes where settlement, cultivation, water management, and transportation overlapped. The forest that now dominates northern Guatemala gives the impression that architecture was inserted into nature. In antiquity, the relationship was almost reversed. Human activity reorganized significant portions of the environment, while patches of managed and unmanaged vegetation persisted between constructed spaces. The rise of these cities also produces a profound paradox. Monumental construction demonstrates success, but every success increases dependence on complex systems. A larger population needs more food, larger ceremonial centers require more labor, expanded architecture consumes more materials. Political leaders must maintain loyalty across greater distances. Water must be captured and stored reliably. Roads must remain usable. Trade must continue. The more impressive the city becomes, the more vulnerable it can become to failures occurring far beyond the temple walls. For the moment, however, those vulnerabilities remain hidden beneath prosperity. The great platforms continue rising. Plazas expand. Ceremonial centers accumulate generations of construction, each rebuilding making the ancient core larger and heavier. From their summits, elites and ritual specialists can look across a landscape increasingly filled with signs of human occupation. And beyond the plazas, another transformation is taking place. Paths between communities are becoming formal routes. Raised roads cross difficult ground, linking settlements that once appeared separate. The civilization is not merely building upward, it is beginning to bind the forest together horizontally. The roads are easy to miss even when standing directly on them. Beneath the forest canopy, an ancient causeway can resemble nothing more than a slightly raised strip of ground, its edges softened by roots, leaf litter, and centuries of erosion. A person walking through the jungle might notice that the terrain feels strangely level for a few hundred meters, and then lose the line entirely beneath vegetation. From the air, however, once the trees are digitally removed, these subtle elevations become unmistakable. Pale linear features stretch between settlements, cross low ground, connect monumental complexes, and continue toward places that once seemed separated by wilderness. What appears today as deep isolation begins to resolve into an ancient network. For the Maya, movement through the landscape is never a minor concern. Tropical lowlands can be difficult terrain. Seasonal rains, flood depressions, and softened soils. Thick vegetation slows travel. Limestone ridges, wetlands, and uneven ground create obstacles that are inconvenient for a single traveller and far more serious for communities trying to move food, construction materials, tribute, ceremonial objects, or large groups of people. Raised causeways offer a solution, built from stone, rubble, earth, and plastered surfaces in some cases. These roads create controlled routes through difficult environments while physically linking important places together. Their Maya name is often rendered as Sacbe, meaning a white road, a reference associated with the pale limestone surfaces that could have made certain causeways bright under sunlight and perhaps even visible in moonlight. Some are relatively short, connecting architectural groups inside a single settlement. Others extend for kilometers between centers in the pre-classic landscapes of northern Guatemala. Remote sensing has revealed networks of raised causeways whose extent suggests that the relationship between ancient settlements was more systematic than earlier explorers could easily perceive. A road is never merely a line between 2 points. Its construction represents a decision about which places matter enough to connect. People must invest labor in raising the surface, preparing edges, crossing low areas, and maintaining the route after storms and vegetation begin reclaiming it. The existence of long causeways therefore implies repeated traffic and enduring relationships. Farmers may use them to reach fields or nearby communities. Traders carry obsidian, salt, ceramics, food, pigments, shell, and other goods. Ritual participants move towards ceremonial centers. Messengers travel between political authorities. Workers may follow the same paths when summoned for construction projects. In times of tension, armies can use roads just as easily as merchants. This interconnectedness changes the way the ancient Maya landscape must be imagined. The famous monumental center is only one node. Around it sit smaller communities, residential groups, agricultural zones, workshops, reservoirs, and local ceremonial spaces. Beyond those lie other centers, sometimes linked by formal routes. A person living outside the monumental core does not necessarily inhabit a remote village cut off from political life. The city may be several kilometers away, but the road, market, ritual calendar, kinship ties, and obligations of labor bring the wider world close. The most dramatic causeway systems also raise questions about political control. Building a road across several kilometers requires coordination beyond a single household. If the road links 2 major centers, who orders its construction? Does one city dominate the other, or are they cooperating? Is the route designed for commerce, ritual, administration, military movement, or all of these at once? Scholars still debate the political meaning of particular networks because the road itself cannot explain who commanded it. Dating is equally important. Features that appear connected on a modern map may have been built or modified at different moments. Even so, their presence reveals something powerful. Ancient Maya communities were investing enormous effort in overcoming distance. That effort extends beyond stone causeways. Rivers, coastal routes, footpaths, and canoe travel create additional layers of connection. The Maya world stretches across environments ranging from tropical lowlands to volcanic highlands and coastlines, and no single region possesses every valuable resource. Obsidian suitable for sharp tools comes from distant volcanic sources. Jade circulates from limited geological zones. Marine shell reaches inland settlements far from the sea. Salt becomes essential not only for diet but for preserving food and supporting dense populations. Cacao, feathers, stone, ceramics, textiles, and other commodities move through systems whose precise organization changes over time. A small object found in an elite burial can therefore contain a map of long-distance relationships. An obsidian blade may originate hundreds of kilometers away. A shell ornament may have begun at a coastline the owner never saw. Such materials demonstrate that forests and mountains are not walls around Maya society. They are spaces crossed repeatedly by people who understand roots, seasonal conditions, political boundaries, and the locations of water. Roads also shape authority symbolically. A causeway approaching a ceremonial center can guide travelers directly toward monumental architecture, controlling the sequence in which buildings appear. The journey itself may become part of ritual experience. Walking along an elevated road above wet or uneven terrain creates a deliberate approach to sacred space. Major plazas and pyramids emerge gradually ahead, framed by the route. Movement is transformed into ceremony. There is a practical side as well. During the rainy season, raised surfaces provide more dependable passage across low terrain. Some road systems may have included drainage features or embankments that altered local water movement. Their construction therefore becomes part of a broader pattern in which the Maya do not simply adapt to the environment, but repeatedly redesign portions of it. One lesser-known detail is the sheer quantity of material needed for even apparently simple causeways. Raising a broad road across a low area can require enormous volumes of fill, much of it moved by human labor. The Maya have no ox carts hauling stone, and no horses pulling wagons during the great periods of indigenous urban development. Loads move primarily on human backs, supported by organized workforces. A causeway several kilometers long is therefore a monument in its own right, even if it lacks the visual drama of a pyramid. The roads also expose a tension that will become increasingly important. Connection brings resilience because communities can exchange goods, information, labor, and support. But connection also spreads instability. Rivalries travel along the same corridors. Political demands reach distant households. Armies can advance more effectively. A city dependent on regional exchange becomes vulnerable when alliances fail or routes become dangerous. Infrastructure ties communities together so closely that trouble in one region can affect people far beyond it. For centuries, however, the expanding networks seem to support growth. Settlement spreads along favorable zones. Ceremonial centers become busier. Goods move farther. The forest contains not scattered islands of occupation, but overlapping corridors of activity. What looks like wilderness today once carries footsteps, burdens, processions, political messages, and the daily traffic of an inhabited world. Yet all of those travelers share one constraint that no road can solve. However efficiently people move through the forest, they cannot carry enough water to sustain entire cities through months without rain. As populations increase, the most important engineering challenge is not simply connecting places, it is learning how to capture the sky itself. Water shapes nearly every decision in the Maya lowlands. From a distance, the region appears overwhelmingly wet, covered by tropical forest and soaked by seasonal storms, yet abundance during part of the year hides a dangerous scarcity during another. In much of the limestone lowlands, rainwater quickly drains through porous ground rather than remaining in permanent rivers or lakes. Months of heavy rainfall can therefore be followed by a dry season in which enormous populations depend on whatever water has been stored. For a village, that problem is serious. For a city containing thousands or tens of thousands of people, it becomes an engineering challenge on which political stability, food production, and survival itself may depend. The Maya respond by reshaping the landscape around them. Natural depressions are enlarged. Reservoirs are constructed or modified near major settlements. Plastered surfaces channel rainfall towards storage areas. Courtyards, plazas, roofs, and paved spaces can become part of a wider collection system, turning architecture into a machine for catching water. Instead of treating a storm as temporary weather, Maya engineers attempt to capture its runoff and preserve it for the months ahead. A city is therefore not simply built beside its water supply. In many places, the city helps create that supply. At Tikal, Large reservoirs occupy important positions near monumental architecture, suggesting that water storage was integrated directly into the urban core. Similar systems appear at other major centres, though their size, design, and importance vary widely. Some reservoirs are formed partly from modified natural depressions, others involve substantial excavation, embankments, plastered surfaces, and channels. Sediment studies indicate that certain Maya water systems were carefully maintained, with accumulated mud removed and surfaces repaired over generations. The evidence suggests a continuous struggle against leakage, contamination, evaporation, and seasonal uncertainty. One particularly surprising aspect of Maya water management is that some reservoirs appear to have included sophisticated forms of filtration. Archaeological research at Tikal has identified imported materials such as quartz-rich sand and zeolite in one reservoir system, substances capable of improving water quality by trapping impurities and potentially removing some harmful compounds. Whether the Maya understood these materials in anything resembling modern chemical terms is impossible to know. They did not need to. Practical observation across generations could reveal that water passing through certain deposits remained clearer or more desirable. What survives in the record suggests that experimentation and accumulated local knowledge were sometimes as important as monumental construction. Water management extends well beyond reservoirs. Farmers modify slopes with terraces that slow runoff and reduce erosion. In wetland zones, channels and raised or drained fields alter the relationship between crops and seasonal flooding. Soil is moved, surfaces are leveled, and low areas are reorganized to make cultivation more dependable. Different environments demand different solutions, and there is no single Maya agricultural system. In one region, farmers exploit well-drained uplands. In another, they intensively manage bayous, wetlands, or seasonally inundated terrain. Households maintain gardens and orchards, while larger agricultural landscapes support staple crops. This variety matters because the old idea that Maya farmers simply cleared forest, planted maize until soils failed, and then moved elsewhere is far too simple. Shifting cultivation certainly existed, but so did more intensive and long-lasting methods: terracing, wetland modification, household gardening, arboriculture, and careful use of local microenvironments reveal a population capable of managing the same areas repeatedly. Maya farming is not one technique but a collection of strategies adapted to different soils, rainfall patterns, population densities, and political demands. Even the forest itself can be managed. Useful trees may be encouraged near settlements, including species valued for fruit, fuel, construction, medicine, fiber, and other purposes. Over centuries, human preference can influence which plants become common in certain areas. The boundary between cultivated land and forest therefore becomes difficult to define. A landscape that appears natural to a modern observer may preserve subtle ecological signatures of ancient management. But intensification carries costs. Terraces require maintenance. Reservoirs must be cleaned. Fields must be replanted. Channels clog. Embankments erode. Forest clearing can increase soil loss if poorly managed. Lime plaster, used extensively on buildings and plazas, requires limestone to be heated at high temperatures, consuming large quantities of fuel. Expanding cities therefore place growing demands on nearby woodland. Archaeologists have found evidence of changing vegetation and erosion around some Maya centres, although the severity and timing differ considerably from place to place. No single explanation fully accounts for how Maya populations balance these pressures across such a large region. Some cities appear to have managed resources successfully for centuries, others suffered environmental degradation. Political power may itself have helped coordinate labour for reservoirs, terraces, and agricultural projects. But centralised control could also make communities vulnerable if rulers demanded too much or failed to respond to crisis. Water management is therefore both an engineering achievement and a political question. Control over reliable water may also have reinforced elite authority. Large reservoirs located near ceremonial and palace complexes could place essential resources close to political centres. During severe dry periods, whoever organised access to water potentially held enormous influence. Yet the extent of direct elite control remains debated. Many household and neighbourhood systems probably operated beyond royal supervision. And water management may have depended as much on local cooperation as on commands from rulers. The agricultural landscape tells a similar story. A field carved into a hillside or a wetland channel several kilometers from a temple may seem mundane compared with royal monuments, but these features represent the foundation of urban life. Every plastered pyramid depends ultimately on food grown somewhere beyond the plaza. Every craft specialist who spends less time farming must be supported by someone else's surplus. Every ruler who commands construction depends on households producing enough maize, beans, squash, and other foods to survive taxation, tribute, ritual obligations, and bad harvests. The system can work remarkably well. Maya cities endure for centuries in environments once considered incapable of supporting such dense populations. Their success is not proof that the landscape is naturally easy. It is proof of how much labour and knowledge are invested in making it productive. Water is stored, slopes are reshaped, wetlands are altered, forest resources are managed, soil is protected where possible. Human settlement becomes inseparable from environmental engineering. That success, however, creates another illusion. The more efficiently a society manages scarcity, the easier it is to forget how close scarcity remains. A reservoir filled after a strong rainy season looks permanent. A terrace producing reliable crops seems stable. A city growing generation after generation begins to feel inevitable. But these systems depend on maintenance, cooperation, and rainfall returning within expected limits. Several unusually dry years can transform engineering advantages into desperate constraints. For now, the reservoirs remain full enough, fields continue producing, and urban populations keep expanding. The landscape becomes increasingly artificial beneath its tropical surface, shaped by walls, channels, terraces, roads, fields, gardens, and waterworks. The forest civilization is no longer merely surviving inside nature. It is reorganizing nature around human needs. And as those engineered landscapes become richer and more productive, the people who control labor, ritual, trade, and access to resources begin to leave their authority in stone more clearly than ever before. As Maya cities grow larger, architecture begins to do more than organize space. It starts to organize power. The distinction is visible in the way monumental centers become increasingly dominated by temples, palaces, restricted courtyards, elevated platforms, and buildings associated with rulers and elite families. These structures are not simply larger versions of ordinary homes. They are designed to separate certain people from everyone else, to control access, to frame public ceremony, and to make political authority appear permanent. A ruler may live only a few decades, but a palace built in stone can survive for centuries. Power becomes part of the landscape. By the Classic period, many Maya kingdoms are ruled by dynasties whose histories are recorded on carved monuments. Stele and architectural inscriptions preserve names, dates, victories, accessions, marriages, rituals, and claims of ancestry. For archaeologists, these texts transform the ancient world from a landscape of anonymous buildings into a political map filled with individual rulers and competing royal houses. Cities that once seemed mysterious begin to reveal their ambitions. Kings present themselves as intermediaries between human communities, ancestors, and supernatural forces, reinforcing the idea that political authority is woven into the cosmic order itself. The buildings surrounding them help make that claim convincing. Temples rise above plazas on steep pyramidal platforms. Palaces occupy prominent positions near ceremonial centers. Restricted courtyards create spaces where only selected individuals can enter. Royal tombs are placed beneath or within important structures, turning architecture into a physical connection between living rulers and powerful ancestors. When later generations renovate or enlarge these buildings, they are not simply improving property. They are building directly over places already saturated with political memory. Public ceremony becomes essential because royal authority must be seen. Large plazas create stages where thousands of people can witness events from below, while rulers and ritual specialists occupy elevated positions above them. Clothing, headdresses, jade ornaments, feathers, painted surfaces, incense, music, and carefully choreographed movement transform architecture into spectacle. The king appears not as an ordinary person standing among other people, but as the central figure within a controlled visual environment. Yet Maya kingship is not based on ritual alone. Warfare becomes one of the clearest ways rulers demonstrate power. Capturing enemies, defeating rival cities, and controlling strategic territories strengthen royal prestige. Inscriptions often emphasize military success because victory validates leadership. Captives can become powerful symbols in public ceremonies, and defeated rulers may be represented in humiliating positions beneath victorious elites. Political authority is therefore both sacred and coercive. Dynastic marriage provides another form of power. Elite families create alliances across political boundaries, linking kingdoms through kinship. A marriage can stabilize relations, strengthen claims to legitimacy, or extend influence into neighboring regions. Royal women sometimes play important political roles in these networks, appearing in inscriptions and dynastic histories that reveal far more complex patterns of authority than older interpretations once assumed. At the same time, kings cannot rule through symbolism alone. Monumental states require administrators, scribes, artisans, nobles, military leaders, ritual specialists, and local authorities who connect the royal court to the wider population. Tribute must be collected, labour must be organised, construction projects must be supplied, foreign goods must be acquired and redistributed. Political systems that appear centred on one ruler actually depend on layers of people whose names often disappear from the surviving record. The palace becomes one of the clearest expressions of this complexity. Some palace compounds contain many rooms arranged around courtyards, with spaces likely used for residence, administration, storage, meetings, ritual, and craft production. Their scale suggests households far larger than a king and immediate family. Retainers, officials, servants, visiting elites, scribes, and other specialists may all have moved through these compounds. The royal court is therefore not simply a household, it is an institution. A lesser-known detail is that Maya monuments were once far more colourful than the weathered grey stone seen today. Many buildings were covered with plaster and painted in vivid pigments. Sculptures and reliefs carried strong reds, blues, yellows, blacks, and other colours. Monumental centres would have looked dramatically different under sunlight, especially when recently resurfaced. The modern ruins, stripped by weather and centuries of exposure, preserve the form of political architecture but only fragments of its original visual intensity. That intensity matters because power depends partly on contrast. Most people live in smaller structures made with perishable materials supported on low stone platforms. Elite buildings tower above them, coated in plaster and positioned around enormous plazas. Valuable materials such as jade and imported obsidian circulate unevenly. Some burials contain elaborate offerings while others are modest. Differences in status become increasingly embedded in architecture, objects, diet, burial practices, and access to ceremonial space. Still, the Maya political landscape is never a single centralized empire controlling the entire region. Instead, numerous kingdoms compete, cooperate, fragment, and reform across centuries. Some cities dominate neighboring centers for long periods, others become subordinate, alliances shift, dynasties rise and disappear. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the precise political relationships between many sites, especially where inscriptions are damaged or undeciphered. This political fragmentation creates both dynamism and instability. Competition encourages rulers to build larger monuments, sponsor elaborate ceremonies, attract skilled artisans, and demonstrate success. But it also generates warfare, tribute demands, and rivalries that can continue for generations. A powerful kingdom must constantly maintain loyalty among subordinate communities while defending itself from equally ambitious neighbours. The built landscape records this pressure. New palaces replace old ones, temples grow higher, fortifications appear in threatened regions. Royal monuments become increasingly concerned with genealogy and victory. Stone is used not merely to shelter people, but to persuade them that a particular political order is ancient, sacred, and unavoidable. Yet beyond the royal courts, most Maya people continue living in smaller household compounds spread across the surrounding countryside. They grow food, raise children, make pottery, maintain orchards, carry water, repair homes, and fulfill obligations to institutions whose monuments dominate the skyline. For generations, archaeology focused heavily on kings because kings left the largest buildings and clearest inscriptions. The forest, however, preserved something much broader. Between the great temples lie thousands upon thousands of ordinary homes. Once those homes begin to appear on modern maps, the ancient Maya world stops looking like a collection of ceremonial capitals. It begins to look like a densely inhabited civilization whose so-called countryside may have been far less empty than anyone once imagined. Once archaeologists begin looking beyond the monumental cores, the ancient Maya landscape changes again. The temples remain important, but they no longer dominate the story in quite the same way. Around them appear thousands of smaller structures, house platforms, patios, storage spaces, workshops, low walls, garden areas, and clusters of buildings arranged around shared courtyards. Some are modest. Others are substantial compounds belonging to wealthy families or local elites. Together they reveal something that the Great Pyramids alone could never show. Maya cities did not end at the edge of the plaza. In many regions, settlement continued outward for kilometers, blending urban neighborhoods, farmland, managed forest, reservoirs, and smaller ceremonial centers into a landscape where the boundary between city and countryside was often surprisingly unclear. This is one of the most important consequences of large-scale mapping. Earlier archaeological maps naturally focused on visible architecture. Monumental buildings were easier to identify, easier to clear, and easier to record. Dense tropical vegetation made the smaller remains between them much harder to detect. A low residential platform buried beneath roots might look like natural ground. A terrace could disappear into a hillside. A household cluster only a few hundred meters from a known temple might remain unrecorded simply because the forest made systematic coverage painfully slow. LIDAR does not remove the need for excavation, but it exposes patterns that once remained hidden. When thousands of subtle elevations are mapped together, neighborhoods emerge, residential compounds appear along ridges and causeways, agricultural modifications spread into areas once labeled empty, smaller centers sit between major cities, suggesting layers of settlement rather than isolated capitals surrounded by unoccupied forest. The image that follows is not one of continuous stone construction stretching from city to city. Maya settlement varies dramatically in density, and large tracts of woodland remain important parts of the landscape. But in heavily populated regions, the distinction between urban centre and rural hinterland is much softer than modern expectations might suggest. One can move outward from a ceremonial core through elite compounds, commoner households, gardens, cultivated plots, workshops, reservoir, terraces, and scattered residences without ever encountering a simple line where the city ends and wilderness begins. Most Maya people live in these less spectacular spaces. Their houses are often built from wooden posts, thatch, plaster, and other perishable materials placed on stone or earthen platforms. The walls and roofs disappear long ago, leaving foundations that can seem insignificant beside temples hundreds of times larger. Yet these small remains preserve the scale of ordinary life. A single compound may contain several buildings around a courtyard, perhaps occupied by an extended family across generations. Nearby are places for cooking, storage, craft activity, gardens, and domestic ritual. Households are not identical. Some contain imported goods, elaborate ceramics, carved stone, jade ornaments, or architecture indicating considerable wealth. Others are much simpler. Social inequality exists outside the palace as well as inside it. Local elites may control productive land, organize labor, maintain relationships with royal courts, or supervise neighborhoods and smaller communities. Political authority therefore extends through a hierarchy of households, rather than operating only from this central palace. Even modest residences can reveal unexpected complexity. Archaeologists find evidence of spinning, weaving, stone tool production, food processing, pottery manufacture, and other specialized activities at household level. Maya economic life is not confined to separate industrial districts. Production frequently occurs where people live. A family may cultivate crops while also making textiles or tools for exchange. Another household may specialize more heavily in particular crafts. This dispersed production helps support markets and tribute systems without requiring every useful object to come from centralized workshops. Around these homes, the environment itself becomes part of domestic economy. Kitchen gardens can provide herbs, chili peppers, medicinal plants, fruits, and other foods. Trees offer shade, timber, fuel, fiber, and edible products. Small animals may be hunted close to settlement, Agricultural fields extend farther outward, while orchards and managed woodland occupy spaces that would look remarkably green even when heavily used. This helps explain why ancient occupation can be visually deceptive. A densely inhabited Maya landscape does not necessarily resemble a modern industrial city. Vegetation remains everywhere. One surprising consequence is that population estimates become extraordinarily difficult. Counting house platforms provides a starting point, but archaeologists must determine which structures are residential, whether they were occupied simultaneously, how many people lived in each household, and how settlement density changed through time. LiDAR may reveal tens of thousands of features, but it cannot by itself tell whether all belong to the same century. Scholars still debate the maximum populations of individual regions, and estimates can vary considerably depending on assumptions. What survives, nevertheless, points toward densities far above the older image of sparse populations clustered around temples. In parts of the central Maya lowlands, large centres were surrounded by substantial settlement, extending across broad zones. Smaller communities filled some of the gaps between political capitals. Agricultural infrastructure suggests that many of these people were not temporary occupants, but part of a landscape requiring continuous investment and maintenance. This changes the meaning of the forest itself. When early explorers encountered enormous trees growing among ruins, they often imagined cities suddenly swallowed by primeval jungle. In reality, some ancient urban surroundings may have contained cultivated fields, orchards, managed stands of useful trees, secondary growth, and patches of older forest in a complex mosaic. After populations declined, vegetation expanded into spaces previously kept open or managed. Centuries later, mature forest created the impression that the environment had always looked this way. The same misconception affects the word civilization. It is tempting to identify civilization with the largest monuments, because those are what survive most dramatically. But the monumental center represents only a fraction of the system. The civilization also exists in the farmer maintaining a terrace, the family cleaning a reservoir edge, the potter firing vessels, the weaver producing cloth, the worker carrying limestone, and the child growing up in a courtyard several kilometers from the royal palace. Their ordinary decisions accumulate into something enormous. Thousands of households create demand for food, water, tools, salt, pottery, stone, textiles, and ceremonial goods. They generate labor for public works and armies. They sustain rulers through tribute. They also create networks of exchange with neighbors, relatives, craftspeople, and market centers. The palace may attempt to organize this world, but it cannot replace it. That realization introduces another layer of the hidden civilization. If so many households are living across the landscape, they must be exchanging far more than food and labor. Objects, ideas, religious practices, information, and specialized knowledge move constantly between communities. Obsidian travels from volcanic highlands. Salt moves inland. Marine shells reach distant cities. Ceramics reveal regional connections. Writing and calendrical systems spread through elite and ritual networks. The forest civilization is therefore not only dense, it is interconnected economically and culturally at nearly every level. Beneath the royal histories carved into stone lies another system, less visible but equally essential, the vast web of everyday exchange that allows a civilization scattered across difficult terrain to behave as part of a larger world. Across the Maya lowlands, connection does not depend on a single institution. No central authority controls every market, road, ritual, workshop, and exchange route. Instead, the civilization functions through overlapping networks that operate at different scales. A household trades with neighbors. A village exchanges food and tools with nearby communities. Local elites maintain relationships with regional courts. Merchants and specialists move valuable goods over hundreds of kilometers. Scribes and priests carry ideas that travel even farther than objects. What makes the Maya world remarkable is not simply that distant cities communicate, but that ordinary economic life, political authority, ritual practice, and specialized knowledge become woven together into a system resilient enough to last for centuries. Markets are one part of that system, although they leave a subtler archaeological signature than temples. A stone pyramid can survive long after abandonment. A market stall made of wood and cloth cannot. Yet evidence from settlement patterns, chemical residues, distribution of goods, and historical accounts suggest that marketplaces played an important role in many Maya cities. Open plazas near major routes may have filled periodically with sellers carrying maize, salt, pottery, stone tools, textiles, cacao, fruits, fish, meat and pigments, ornaments, and countless everyday necessities. In some cities, markets may have operated under elite supervision. Elsewhere, exchange could have been more decentralized. The importance of markets becomes easier to understand when population density increases. A household can produce much of what it needs, but not everything. Farmers require tools, potters need fuel and clay, stoneworkers need suitable raw material. Urban residents who devote more time to administration, ritual, military service, or craft production depend increasingly on food supplied by others. Exchange allows specialization to deepen. A skilled artisan can spend more time producing high-quality goods if those goods can be traded for food. Household production remains central. Maya homes are not merely places of consumption. Archaeologists find spindle whorls, grinding stones, chipped stone debris, ceramic production waste, and other traces of work carried out within residential compounds. Textiles are particularly important, although cloth rarely survives in tropical environments. Spinning and weaving require enormous labor, and textiles probably serve as practical clothing, valuable exchange goods, tribute, and markers of identity. Because most cloth disappears, the economic importance of textile production is almost certainly underrepresented in the archaeological record. Stone tools reveal a different network. Obsidian, a volcanic glass capable of producing exceptionally sharp edges, does not occur naturally across much of the Maya lowlands, yet obsidian blades and fragments appear widely in archaeological sites. Their chemical composition can often be matched to particular volcanic sources, allowing researchers to reconstruct trade patterns across astonishing distances. A blade discarded in a lowland household may contain geological evidence of a journey beginning in the highlands of Guatemala or central Mexico. The same principle applies to other valued materials. Jadeite travels from restricted source regions and becomes associated with wealth, ritual, and royal status. Marine shell moves far inland. Salt produced along coasts or saline zones becomes indispensable to populations living away from those sources. Cacao circulates both as food and as a prestigious commodity. Feathers from tropical birds, pigments, fine ceramics, stone, and other goods pass through exchange systems that connect environments separated by forests, mountains, and political boundaries. These routes do not simply carry objects, they carry information. Merchants and travellers learn which cities are at war, where harvests are poor, which rulers have died, and which roads are unsafe. They bring news of ceremonies, political changes, fashions, technologies, and distant places. In a world without printing presses or electronic communication, human movement itself becomes an information network. Writing gives that information another form. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas, capable of recording language through combinations of signs representing sounds and words. Inscriptions preserve royal genealogies, rituals, battles, accessions, captures, deaths, and calendrical dates with extraordinary precision. The surviving texts are heavily biased toward elite concerns because stone monuments and painted ceramics are more likely to endure than perishable records, but they reveal a society where trained scribes possess highly specialized knowledge. Writing almost certainly once existed on many materials that have disappeared. Bark paper books, wooden objects, painted textiles, and other perishable records would have been vulnerable to humidity, decay, warfare, and later destruction. Only a tiny number of pre-Columbian Maya codices survive. What remains is therefore a fraction of a much larger written tradition. The silence in the record does not mean the knowledge never existed. It means tropical time is selective. Calendrical and astronomical knowledge forms another part of this intellectual network. Maya specialists track cycles of the sun, moon, Venus, and other celestial phenomena, integrating astronomical observations with ritual calendars and political ceremonies. Their achievements are sometimes exaggerated into claims of mysterious or impossible knowledge, but the real accomplishment requires no fantasy. Repeated observation over generations, careful record-keeping, mathematical skill. and institutional continuity can produce remarkably accurate systems. Astronomy is not separate from politics. Important dates can shape ceremonies, dedications, warfare, and royal presentation. Architecture itself may be oriented towards significant solar positions or other calendrical events, although scholars must be careful not to interpret every alignment as intentional. In some ceremonial complexes, repeated architectural arrangements appear to have helped communities observe seasonal solar movement, linking the sky to public ritual and agricultural time. Religion likewise flows through every layer of Maya society rather than existing only inside temples. Households maintain domestic rituals and ancestor traditions. Caves, mountains, springs, reservoirs, and other landscape features can hold sacred significance. Royal ceremonies occur on monumental stages, but ordinary families also participate in offerings, burials, feasts, and commemorations. Belief gives meaning to agriculture, rain, political authority, illness, death, ancestry, and the passage of time. This shared religious framework helps connect communities that remain politically divided. Two kingdoms may fight bitterly while still using related calendars, writing traditions, architectural forms, deities, and ritual concepts. Maya civilization is therefore culturally interconnected without being politically unified. That distinction is essential. There is no single Maya empire directing the entire forest world. There are many competing states participating in a broader civilization. The network can absorb conflict because exchange often continues across political boundaries, but the same interdependence creates vulnerability. A disrupted trade route can limit access to obsidian or salt. Warfare can isolate communities. Political collapse in one region can redirect merchants and alliances elsewhere. Drought can raise food prices or intensify demands on neighboring zones. The stronger the web becomes, the more consequences can travel through it. For centuries, the system continues to function despite rivalry. Goods cross distances, scribes preserve dynastic memory, farmers feed cities, traders carry information, priests calculate sacred cycles, markets turn surplus into survival. Yet beneath this interconnected world, competition among kingdoms is becoming sharper. Causeways that carry merchants can also carry soldiers, and walls that once organized space begin to acquire a more defensive purpose. The hidden forest network is approaching a period when connection no longer guarantees stability. In some regions, the architecture itself begins to reveal that people are preparing not for exchange, but for attack. The first signs of growing danger are not always dramatic. A wall appears where none was needed before. A ditch is cut across an approach to a settlement. A ridge is reinforced with earthworks. A causeway narrows at a point that can be easily controlled. Buildings are placed in defensible positions, and settlements once oriented toward open movement begin turning inward. In the tropical lowlands, where vegetation can conceal almost anything, these features remain difficult to recognize for generations. Once mapped across large areas, however, they reveal a political landscape increasingly shaped by fear. The Maya world is still trading, farming, building, and performing ritual, but many kingdoms are also preparing for war. Warfare is not new. Conflict exists long before the later classic period, and inscriptions from many cities celebrate victories, captures, and military achievements. What changes in certain regions is its intensity and the degree to which conflict begins altering entire landscapes. Defensive systems suggest that warfare is no longer limited to symbolic encounters between elites or occasional raids. Some communities are preparing for attacks serious enough to threaten settlements, agricultural zones, and political centers themselves. The geography of Maya politics encourages rivalry. Dozens of kingdoms exist relatively close to one another, each ruled by dynasties seeking prestige, allies, tribute, territory, and influence. A successful ruler can subordinate smaller centers and draw them into a wider political network. A weakened ruler can lose those allies quickly. The result is a constantly shifting map. One generation inherits an alliance that seemed permanent. The next finds that the same neighbor has changed sides. Two of the most powerful political spheres during the Classic period are associated with Tikal and the Kanul dynasty, whose rulers are closely linked with Calakmul during much of their rivalry. Their competition reaches far beyond the capitals themselves. Smaller kingdoms become allies, clients, proxies, or targets. Warfare between major powers can therefore spread through political chains extending across much of the central lowlands. A battle occurring far from Tikal or Kalak Mul may still be connected to their broader struggle for influence. This does not mean every war belongs to a simple two-sided contest. Maya politics is far too complicated for that. Cities pursue their own interests, switch loyalties, rebel against patrons, and exploit periods when larger powers are distracted. Inscriptions reveal alliances being constructed through marriage, ritual participation, and military cooperation, then broken when circumstances change. Scholars still debate many details because inscriptions survive unevenly and usually present events from the perspective of rulers who have every reason to exaggerate their own success. Archaeology provides a harder kind of evidence. At sites where defensive works have been identified, ditches, walls, embankments, and naturally protected ridges show that communities anticipated physical attack. Some fortifications are substantial enough to require organised labour comparable to major civic projects. Building defences means diverting workers from agriculture, construction, or other tasks. It represents a significant investment in something everyone hopes will never be tested. At places such as La Cuernavilla and other fortified locations revealed through modern mapping, defensive arrangements emphasise the seriousness of conflict in parts of the Maya landscape. More famous examples, including fortifications around sites such as Tikal and strategic defences elsewhere, have long contributed to changing interpretations of Maya warfare. Earlier Romantic portrayals sometimes imagined the classic Maya as predominantly peaceful astronomers and ritualists. That image has not survived contact with the evidence. The inscriptions are particularly clear about captive taking. Maya rulers frequently commemorate the seizure of high-ranking enemies because capturing a rival noble or king has political value far beyond killing anonymous soldiers. A defeated elite can become proof that the victor has overturned the sacred and political order of another dynasty. Captives may be publicly displayed, incorporated into ritual, and represented on monuments in positions of humiliation. But warfare can be far more destructive than elite capture. Archaeologists have identified evidence at some sites suggesting attacks involving burning and widespread destruction. The ancient city of Huitzna in Guatemala provides one striking case. Archaeological evidence of severe burning corresponds with inscriptions referring to warfare in the region during the late 7th century. The combination suggests an assault intended not merely to take a ruler captive but to damage the settlement on a larger scale. Such events complicate the idea that Maya warfare follows a restrained ritual code. Conflict can involve real devastation. Homes can burn, crops can be destroyed, agricultural labour can be interrupted, people may flee, trade routes become dangerous, reservoirs and food supplies become vulnerable. Even if an attacking army does not occupy a city permanently, the disruption caused by violence can weaken its economy for years. Ordinary families experience war differently from rulers whose victories are carved onto monuments. A royal inscription may reduce an entire campaign to a date, a title, and a defeated enemy. For farmers living near contested territory, the same event means abandoned fields, destroyed houses, shortages, forced labour, or relocation. Archaeology rarely preserves their names, but settlement changes can reveal the consequences. Some communities move toward more defensible terrain. Others decline or disappear. Defensive positions become more heavily occupied. Warfare also places pressure on the alliances that hold kingdoms together. Subordinate centres may stop paying tribute when a patron becomes weak. Rival rulers can encourage rebellion. A city suffering military defeat can lose prestige as well as territory. In a political system where rulers justify authority partly through supernatural legitimacy and public success, repeated failure becomes dangerous. A king unable to protect allies, secure trade, or deliver victories risks appearing not merely unlucky but fundamentally ineffective. This creates a vicious cycle. Competition encourages rulers to invest more heavily in armies, monuments, and alliances. Those investments require tribute and labour. Greater demands can strain households already responsible for agriculture and infrastructure. Military campaigns take workers away from fields. Fortifications require construction. Failed wars bring captives, lost territory, and damaged prestige. Victory may solve some problems temporarily while creating new enemies. The forests themselves shape how these conflicts unfold. Dense vegetation limits visibility. ridges and narrow approaches become strategically valuable. Roads that once make exchange easier can channel movement toward defensible points. Water sources matter enormously because armies moving through the lowlands must remain supplied. Political geography is therefore inseparable from environmental geography. Yet there is no single moment when the Maya world simply becomes consumed by warfare. Many regions continue prospering. Some kingdoms experience long periods of stability. Others decline while neighboring centers grow. The archaeological record is uneven, and no single explanation fully accounts for the different trajectories. What survives suggests a patchwork of local crises embedded within broader political competition. Still, by the 8th century in parts of the southern lowlands, pressure is becoming harder to ignore. Inscriptions record increasingly complicated conflicts. Fortifications appear in strategic landscapes. Dynasties struggle to preserve alliances. Political centers that once projected confidence begin operating in a world where rivals can destroy decades of accumulated power. Then another difficulty emerges, one no army can defeat. The rainfall patterns on which the lowland system depends begin showing signs of dangerous instability, and kingdoms already spending energy on rivalry face a problem far larger than any neighboring city. To understand just how much pressure such a civilization could absorb, archaeologists first needed to know what the civilization actually looked like on the ground. For most of the 20th century, that remained a frustratingly incomplete task. Excavation could reveal a palace in extraordinary detail. Survey teams could map streets of buildings around a ceremonial center. Researchers could walk transects through the forest and record mounds, terraces, walls, and reservoirs one feature at a time. But the Maya lowlands are vast, humid, and heavily vegetated. Even the best ground survey could only illuminate fragments of a landscape whose most important patterns might stretch across dozens or hundreds of square kilometers. The forest turned archaeology into a puzzle assembled, while most of the pieces remained face down. Then laser mapping changed the scale of observation. LiDAR, short for light detection and ranging, works by sending enormous numbers of laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground. Many pulses strike the upper canopy and return immediately. Others pass between leaves and branches, reaching lower vegetation or the forest floor before reflecting back. By measuring the time those signals take to return, researchers can calculate elevation with remarkable precision. Computers then separate much of the vegetation from the terrain beneath it, producing models that allow archaeologists to examine the shape of the ground as though the canopy had become transparent. The effect can feel almost impossible the first time such an image is seen. A region that appears from the air as uninterrupted green suddenly fills with geometry. Rectangular platforms emerge beneath trees, straight embankments cross valleys, terraces wrap around hills, reservoirs become visible as engineered depressions, causeways connect concentrations of settlement, defensive walls follow ridges, quarry pits scar areas close to construction zones. Thousands of house platforms appear around centers once mapped mainly for their temples. LiDAR does not discover civilization by itself. Many of the sites it maps have been known locally or archaeologically for generations. Maya communities have long lived among ancient ruins, and researchers had already identified numerous settlements, roads, terraces, and defensive works before aircraft carried laser scanners over them. What the technology provides is continuity. Features previously studied as separate discoveries can suddenly be seen together across an entire region. Relationships that would require months of difficult walking become visible on a screen. The continuity produces some of the most dramatic surprises. In parts of northern Guatemala, surveys reveal settlement densities far higher than earlier maps suggested. Around major centers, archaeologists see residential groups packed into favorable terrain. Elsewhere, they find long raised causeways linking monumental sites with surrounding communities. Agricultural terraces and field modifications appear over wide areas. Defensive systems reveal strategic planning on a scale that could not be appreciated from isolated trenches or small survey zones. Some of the numbers reported after major LiDAR projects sound extraordinary, which is exactly why they require careful interpretation. Tens of thousands of previously unmapped structures can appear within a single survey area, but a detected feature is not automatically a house, and a house is not automatically occupied during the same period as every neighboring house. LiDAR reveals form, not chronology. Archaeologists must still enter the forest, inspect the feature, collect ceramics, excavate deposits, date construction phases, and determine how it fits into the sequence of occupation. This is one of the most important limitations of the technology. A digital terrain model can make the ancient landscape appear frozen in a single moment, as though every road, wall, reservoir, palace, and house existed simultaneously. In reality, those features may represent centuries of change. A causeway could be built long before a nearby defensive wall. A residential group may be abandoned while another expands. A reservoir can be modified repeatedly, without archaeological dating. The image compresses history. Yet even with that caution, the transformation in understanding is profound. Archaeologists no longer need to assume that blank spaces on old maps were empty. Many were simply unsurveyed. The difference sounds obvious, but for decades those blanks subtly shaped theories. If a monumental centre appeared surrounded by little recorded settlement, researchers might infer that it functioned primarily as a ceremonial place, serving a dispersed rural population. When LiDAR fills the surrounding terrain with house platforms and infrastructure, the interpretation must change. The technology also reveals features that are not glamorous enough to attract early explorers, but are essential to reconstructing Maya society. A low terrace only half a metre high may tell researchers how farmers protected soil. A ditch cutting across a ridge may reveal military anxiety. A small reservoir may show how one neighbourhood managed dry season water. A quarry near a ceremonial complex can indicate where building materials originated, collectively. These subtle modifications tell a story of labour that monumental architecture alone tends to hide. One lesser-known advantage of LiDAR is its ability to help archaeologists plan fieldwork more intelligently. Instead of cutting trails almost blindly through dense vegetation, teams can identify unusual features before reaching them. A suspicious rectangular mound can be inspected. A line stretching across several kilometres can be tested as a possible causeway. A hilltop enclosure can be checked for fortifications. This does not make field archaeology easy. The forest still involves heat, insects, difficult terrain, and limited access, but it greatly improves the questions researchers can ask once they arrive. It also corrects human perception. On foot, the scale of the forest is deceptive. A person can stand beside a mound without realizing that it belongs to a residential complex extending beyond the visible trees. Two ridges may seem unrelated because vegetation hides the low causeway between them. A defensive wall can disappear beneath roots and leaf litter, only to reappear hundreds of meters away. LiDAR restores those missing connections. The result is almost the inverse of early exploration. 19th and 20th century visitors often described monumental ruins emerging mysteriously from wilderness. Modern remote sensing instead reveals wilderness resting on top of architecture, agriculture, roads, and settlement. The jungle has not merely surrounded Maya cities, it has concealed the shape of a much larger human landscape. But the lasers create a new problem precisely because they reveal so much. Once tens of thousands of structures become visible, archaeologists must estimate how many people they represent. A cluster of platforms becomes a household. Households become communities. Communities become regional populations. Small assumptions begin multiplying across enormous areas. The hidden civilization is now visible in outline. The next mystery is how many people once lived inside it. Population is where the hidden landscape becomes almost overwhelming. A single house platform is easy to understand. A cluster of compounds around a plaza is still manageable. But once thousands of residential features appear across hundreds of square kilometers, archaeology moves from mapping buildings to reconstructing an entire human ecology. How many people lived in those houses? How many structures were occupied at the same time? How much food did they need? How much water could the landscape provide? Every estimate forces another question, and each answer changes the scale of Maya civilization. Earlier population models were often conservative because archaeologists could only count what had been surveyed. Dense forest made that difficult, and unsurveyed areas tended to remain blank on maps. LiDAR filled many of those blanks with structures. In some regions, residential compounds stretch far beyond monumental centres, appearing on ridges, near wetlands, along causeways, and across terrain once assumed to have been lightly occupied. This does not mean every hectare was crowded. But it does suggest that the central lowland supported far more people than the old image of isolated ceremonial capitals once implied. Turning those structures into population numbers is complicated. Archaeologists cannot simply count mounds and multiply by an average household size. Some mounds are kitchens, storage buildings, workshops, shrines, or abandoned foundations rather than residences. A compound containing several buildings may represent one extended family rather than several independent households. Some structures belong to different centuries. Others may have been used seasonally. The evidence remains incomplete. And scholars still debate regional population estimates precisely because small assumptions can produce dramatically different totals. Even cautious estimates, however, raise a larger problem. Dense populations must be fed every day. The Maya lowlands do not contain unlimited agricultural land. Soils vary in quality, rainfall is seasonal, and some areas are too wet, too dry, too steep, or too rocky for easy cultivation. Supporting large urban populations therefore requires more than simply clearing additional forest. Farmers must make different environments productive in different ways. Terraces protect slopes, wetland fields increase usable land, gardens supplement staple crops, forest resources are harvested and managed. Fields are rotated, soils maintained, and local knowledge accumulated across generations. Maize remains central, but the agricultural system cannot be reduced to maize alone. Beans provide important protein and help diversify diets. Squash, chili peppers, root crops, fruits, tree crops, and gathered foods contribute to nutrition and resilience. Hunting, fishing, and the capture of small animals add further resources. Food production is spread across a mosaic of fields, gardens, orchards, wetlands, and managed forest rather than one uniform agricultural zone. This diversity helps explain how populations could grow, but it also increases the labour required to maintain the landscape. A terrace must be repaired after erosion. A reservoir must be cleared of sediment. A canal can clog. A field can lose productivity. Trees must be managed over years rather than months. Urban density therefore rests on continuous labour, performed mostly by people whose names never appear in inscriptions. The burden becomes greater when political obligations are added. Farmers do not work only for themselves. They may owe labour for roads, temples, palaces, reservoirs, fortifications, or royal ceremonies. Tribute can include food, textiles, craft goods, or other resources. Men may be drawn into military service. Families also participate in local ritual obligations and household production. A city with impressive monuments represents not merely surplus wealth, but a constant competition for human time. This is where population density becomes politically dangerous. A ruler can demand more labour when harvests are strong. The same demand becomes far harder to sustain after a poor rainy season. A reservoir can support many people when fully replenished, but becomes a source of tension when water falls below expected levels. An agricultural system optimized for high productivity may prove less flexible when rainfall patterns shift. The very efficiency that permits large populations can reduce room for error. Environmental evidence suggests that some Maya regions experience significant human impact. Pollen records can show changes in forest composition. Sediments can reveal erosion. Charcoal can indicate burning. Wetland deposits preserve traces of cultivation and land modification. Around heavily occupied areas, these signals sometimes point to substantial deforestation or intensified land use, yet the pattern is not uniform. Some communities maintained productive landscapes for long periods, and scholars increasingly reject simplistic claims that the Maya merely destroyed their environment and collapsed as a result. The reality is more interesting. Maya societies appear capable of sophisticated environmental management, but no management system is invulnerable. A landscape supporting a moderate population can absorb stress differently from one supporting a dense urban network. If drought lasts longer than expected, if warfare interrupts farming, if rulers increase demands, or if trade becomes unstable, several pressures can reinforce one another. Population estimates therefore matter because they reveal the scale of risk as much as the scale of achievement. A city of a few thousand people can survive a local shortage by drawing on surrounding territory. A region filled with many large settlements may have far fewer untouched reserves. Neighbouring communities are not empty sources of emergency food. They have their own populations, obligations, and vulnerabilities. a settlement becomes denser. The margin between abundance and shortage can narrow. The same principle applies to water. More people mean more reservoirs, more maintenance, and greater dependence on seasonal rainfall. In many lowland cities, there is no large permanent river providing an unlimited flow through the urban core. Stored rainwater becomes strategic infrastructure. A sequence of dry years could therefore threaten not only agriculture, but the ability of people to remain physically concentrated in the city. Yet dense population also creates strengths. Large labour forces can build enormous reservoirs, repair terraces, construct roads, and respond collectively to environmental challenges. Markets distribute food between neighbourhoods. Political alliances can redirect resources. Specialised knowledge improves agricultural and hydraulic systems. Population itself is not a problem. It becomes dangerous only when institutions and environments fail to adapt quickly enough. What survives in the archaeological records suggests that for centuries the Maya do adapt. That is precisely why their eventual political disruptions cannot be explained by one simple environmental mistake. The system is flexible, productive, and experienced. Its cities have survived earlier droughts, wars, dynastic struggles, and local abandonments. But by the later classic period, several stresses begin occurring together. Some rulers face intensified warfare. Political alliances fracture. Monument building continues to demand labour. Evidence from paleoclimate records indicates repeated episodes of severe drought in parts of the Maya region. Not every city experiences these pressures at the same time or in the same way, but the combination becomes increasingly dangerous. The population mystery therefore leads directly into the collapse mystery. The question is no longer simply how many people the lowlands could support at their height. It is what happens when a densely interconnected civilization, already operating close to environmental and political limits in some regions, begins to face multiple failures at once. The forest has revealed how large the system was. Now the evidence begins to show how much strain that system was carrying. The strain does not arrive as a single catastrophe. There is no one morning when the Maya lowlands wake to find their civilization broken. Instead, pressure accumulates unevenly across decades and regions, sometimes almost invisibly. One kingdom loses an ally, another suffers a failed harvest. A reservoir fills less completely than expected. A ruler responds to weakness by demanding more labour for monuments or warfare. A neighbouring city seizes the opportunity to attack. None of these events alone must produce collapse. Together, repeated often enough, they begin to undermine the system that had made dense urban life possible. Climate evidence adds one of the most important pieces to this puzzle. Sediments from lakes and wetlands, mineral deposits from caves, and other paleoclimate records indicate that parts of the Maya region experienced significant episodes of drought during the later Classic period, particularly between the 8th and 10th centuries. The exact timing, intensity, and geographic reach vary between records, and scholars still debate how individual drought episodes affected particular cities. Yet the broader pattern is increasingly difficult to ignore. Several periods of reduced rainfall coincide with profound political disruption across portions of the southern lowlands. For a society built around seasonal water storage, even modest changes in rainfall can have large consequences. Reservoir systems depend not simply on rain falling eventually, but on enough rain arriving during the wet season to refill storage before months of dryness begin. A single bad year can be survived through reserves, altered planting strategies, exchange, or migration. Several dry years close together are different. Reservoir levels fall, crops become unreliable. Forest resources are placed under greater pressure. Communities begin competing for water and productive land at precisely the moment political institutions are also struggling. Drought alone, however, cannot explain what follows. This distinction matters because simple collapse stories are attractive. They provide one cause, one crisis, and one ending. The Maya evidence refuses that simplicity. Some regions decline before the strongest drought signals. Others remain occupied through severe climatic stress. Northern centres sometimes grow while southern cities lose population. Coastal and riverine communities experience different conditions from inland settlements dependent on reservoirs. If drought were the only cause, the pattern should be far more uniform than archaeology reveals. Political fragmentation makes the environmental problem more dangerous. Maya kingdoms rarely cooperate as a single regional authority. When rainfall declines, rulers are not coordinating a civilization-wide emergency response. They are often competing with one another, alliances remain unstable, warfare redirects labor and resources. A ruler facing food shortages may still need to defend borders, maintain elite loyalty, sponsor rituals, and demonstrate strength. Political weakness can invite attack. So reducing military expenditure may be impossible even when the economy is under strain. This creates a severe contradiction. The same royal system that once coordinated monumental labor and water management may become less capable of adaptation because its legitimacy depends on maintaining traditional displays of authority. Monument construction, ritual performance, elite consumption, and warfare are not simply luxuries that can be abandoned without consequence. They help define political order. Cutting them may preserve resources while simultaneously making the ruler appear weak. Archaeological sequences at several cities suggest that monumental building continues surprisingly late into periods of instability. Some rulers erect inscriptions and dedicate structures even as regional networks begin fragmenting. From one perspective, this might seem irrational. From another, it is exactly what political leaders do when legitimacy is threatened. They emphasize continuity, ancestry, victory, and sacred authority more strongly. Ordinary households carry much of the cost. If harvests shrink while tribute demands remain high, families have fewer reserves. If warfare removes laborers from fields, agricultural productivity can decline further. If roads become unsafe, market exchange becomes less reliable. If reservoirs are controlled by political authorities or neighborhoods competing for access, water scarcity can intensify social tension. None of these pressures necessarily leaves a clear inscription. They appear indirectly through abandoned residences, nutritional stress, changing settlement patterns, altered diets, and migration. There is also the problem of environmental feedback. Deforestation around heavily populated centers can increase erosion and reduce the resilience of local ecosystems. More land may need to be cultivated when yields fall, encouraging further clearing. Burning vegetation releases nutrients temporarily, but can degrade soils if cycles become too short. Fuel requirements remain high, particularly where lime plaster continues to be produced. Again, the evidence varies greatly by location, and it would be misleading to imagine the Maya lowlands as universally exhausted. But some densely occupied regions appear to have had fewer ecological buffers available when drought intensified. Water quality may deteriorate as reservoirs shrink. Lower water levels concentrate contaminants. Sediment and organic material become more significant. People and animals crowd around fewer reliable sources. Even a technically sophisticated reservoir cannot create water when rainfall repeatedly fails to replenish it. The political map begins changing rapidly. Long-established dynasties lose influence. Monument dates become less frequent in some centers. Royal inscriptions, once an almost continuous record of accession, warfare, and ceremony, suddenly stop. This silence is one of the most haunting archaeological signals of the classic Maya political collapse. A city may continue to contain people after the final dated monument, but the institution that commissioned those monuments is no longer functioning in the same way. At Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and many other southern lowland centers, the trajectories differ in detail but share a broad pattern of political contraction. Some courts disappear. Monument construction slows or ends. Elite compounds are abandoned. Population declines follow, although not always immediately. The process unfolds over generations rather than days. One lesser-known aspect of the collapse is how selective it can be within a single landscape. A ceremonial core may lose its royal court while surrounding households continue for years. One neighborhood empties while another remains occupied. Rural communities can outlast kings. This suggests that what collapses first is often not Maya society itself, but the political architecture that had concentrated power in monumental centers. No single explanation fully accounts for why one kingdom fails earlier than another. Drought, warfare, soil stress, trade disruption, elite competition, population pressure, and social unrest interact differently in different places. The search for a universal trigger increasingly gives way to the idea of cascading failure. A society can manage one problem, it can often manage several, but once failures begin reinforcing one another, recovery becomes progressively harder. A drought reduces food, shortage weakens political authority, weakness encourages enemies, Warfare disrupts farming and trade. Disruption reduces revenue. Rulers increase demands. Households migrate. Abandoned fields reduce local production further. Every step makes the next crisis harder to absorb. By the 9th century, this process is reshaping much of the southern lowland world. The great cities are not all destroyed. Many are simply losing the human systems that kept them functioning. Reservoirs remain, temples remain, causeways remain, palaces remain. The people, however, are beginning to leave. The departure is rarely dramatic enough to resemble the end of a civilization. There are no universal evacuation orders, no single final battle, no moment when every plaza falls silent at once. Instead, households make decisions one at a time. A family leaves a neighborhood where water has become unreliable. Another moves toward relatives in a more secure region. Farmers abandon marginal fields that no longer justify the labor required to maintain them. Elites disappear from palace compounds. Craftspeople follow the markets that once supported them. Over years and generations, the population thins. Buildings that were once repaired every season begin to crack. Plaster peels away. Courtyards fill with debris. The city does not vanish. Its human density does. This is one of the most important distinctions in the entire story. The classic Maya political collapse is not the disappearance of the Maya people. Millions of Maya descendants live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and neighboring regions today, maintaining languages, communities, traditions, and identities that survived centuries of political upheaval, colonial violence, forced conversion, economic exploitation, and modern conflict. What declined in many southern lowland centres during the 9th and 10th centuries were particular forms of royal government, urban concentration, and dynastic authority. The archaeological record makes this visible through absence. A palace may stop being maintained. A monumental inscription tradition ends. A once crowded residential district shows fewer signs of rebuilding. Ceramics change. Burial practices shift. Some structures are reused for purposes their builders never intended. In places, people move into formerly elite spaces after the court has disappeared. Stone once reserved for monuments can be scavenged for more practical construction. The sacred geometry of the city begins to loosen as political hierarchy loses its force. At some sites, the decline is gradual enough that several generations may live among increasingly empty monuments. A child could grow up beside a pyramid built when the city was far more powerful, knowing it not as an ancient ruin but as a structure from the world of grandparents and ancestors. The emotional experience is impossible to reconstruct directly, but the physical setting would have been strange. Buildings remain enormous even after the institutions behind them weaken. Abandonment does not immediately erase authority from architecture. Migration is one of the clearest ways communities respond. People move toward regions offering better water, trade, political security, or agricultural opportunity. Northern parts of the Maya world continue to support major centers after many southern lowland capitals decline. Cities in the northern Yucatan, including places associated with later flourishing political networks, demonstrate that Maya society is reorganizing rather than simply ending. Coastal routes also become increasingly important in some periods, shifting exchange toward different corridors. Population movement may have been local in many cases. A family does not need to migrate hundreds of kilometers to leave a failing political system. Moving 10 or 20 kilometers toward a more reliable water source, a relative's community, or a smaller settlement can be enough. These short-distance migrations are much harder to detect archaeologically than mass population movements, but they help explain how urban centers can lose people without evidence for a single catastrophic exodus. Some communities may deliberately choose smaller-scale organization. Large cities offer markets, protection, ceremony, and access to political institutions, but they also impose obligations, tribute, labor service, military demands, and competition for land become less attractive when royal systems fail to provide stability in return. A household that once depended on the city may eventually decide that the costs exceed the benefits. This possibility challenges the language of collapse itself. From the perspective of a king whose dynasty disappears, the event is catastrophic. From the perspective of a farming family that relocates and continues cultivating land elsewhere, it may be a painful adaptation rather than an ending. Archaeologists see the abandonment of monuments because stone survives. Human continuity is less visible because people carry their lives away with them. The process also varies sharply between regions. Some cities experience severe depopulation. Others maintain reduced communities for centuries. Certain centres are later reoccupied. Political power shifts rather than simply evaporating. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much migration, mortality, conflict, and demographic contraction contributed to the changing population patterns. What is clear is that no single map of empty cities can represent the entire Maya world. There are also signs that ordinary people adapt in ways royal institutions could not. Household economies can be flexible. Families alter crops, exchange networks, settlement locations, and labour strategies. Political courts are less flexible because their legitimacy depends on specific places, monuments, genealogies, and ritual traditions. A dynasty tied to one sacred capital cannot relocate as easily as a farming household can move toward better land. This difference may help explain why some royal centres disappear while Maya culture persists. Writing traditions change, political institutions reorganize, religious practices continue in altered forms, languages survive, agricultural knowledge survives, stories, place names, ritual concepts, and social identities persist even when monumental architecture is no longer maintained. One particularly striking detail is that some abandoned cities remain known long after large populations leave them. They are not necessarily forgotten instantly. Nearby communities may continue visiting ruins, using old reservoirs, passing through former plazas, collecting stone, farming nearby land, or treating ancient buildings as sacred places. The idea of a city disappearing completely from human memory belongs more to later outsiders than to the people who remained in the region. Centuries later, when Europeans arrive, they encounter living Maya societies, not the remnants of an extinct people. They find cities, political communities, agricultural systems, religious traditions, books, markets, and resistance. The colonial period brings devastating epidemics, warfare, enslavement, forced labour, religious destruction, and population loss. But even those events fail to erase Maya identity. The Great Southern Lowland abandonment therefore becomes something more complicated than a vanished civilization. It is a reorganization of where people live and how power operates. Monumental capitals decline, but cultural worlds continue around and beyond them. Meanwhile, the empty architecture begins its second life, without thousands of hands clearing plazas, repairing roofs, burning vegetation, maintaining drains, and resurfacing walls. The tropical environment returns quickly. Seeds take root in cracks, trees rise from courtyards, roots force apart masonry, leaf litter buries floors, animals move through abandoned rooms. Within a few generations, the city starts to look less like a city. Within centuries, it begins to look like forest. Once maintenance stops, the forest begins working with astonishing patience. A plaza that once required constant clearing collects leaves after every rainy season. Seeds lodge in cracks between stones. Grasses and shrubs spread across surfaces once kept smooth by generations of human feet. Small roots become large roots. Water enters joints in masonry, widening them through repeated cycles of saturation and drying. Trees establish themselves on terraces, courtyards, walls, and even temple summits. Their trunks rise while their roots push downward through ancient construction fill, slowly breaking apart buildings that had survived wars, dynasties, and political collapse. The transformation does not happen overnight, but tropical growth is relentless. Architecture begins to lose its edges. This is how a city becomes a hill. A low residential platform disappears first. Without walls or a thatched roof, its foundation becomes covered by soil and vegetation until only a slight elevation remains. Larger buildings hold their shape longer, but collapsed upper walls fill courtyards with rubble. Stairways vanish beneath sediment. Plaster dissolves or flakes away. Decorative facades erode. A temple that once gleamed under sunlight becomes a dark mound supporting mature trees. After several centuries, someone unfamiliar with the landscape can walk beside an enormous human-made structure and mistake it for natural topography. The paradox is that the same forest that hides the ruins also helps preserve portions of them. Vegetation can damage masonry, But once urban surfaces are buried beneath accumulated soil and leaf litter, some features become protected from direct weathering and later construction. In places where modern development remains limited, roads, terraces, foundations, reservoirs, and earthworks can survive precisely because nobody has leveled them for agriculture or built a new city over the top. The forest conceals destruction as well as preservation, producing an archaeological landscape that is both damaged and remarkably intact. For early explorers entering the Maya lowlands from outside the region, this created an almost irresistible illusion. Monumental ruins appeared to rise from what seemed like primordial wilderness. Enormous trees stood on pyramids. Vines crossed carved stone. Animals moved through abandoned courtyards. The visual contrast suggested a civilization that had somehow appeared in the jungle and then disappeared from it, leaving nature to reclaim an environment that had always been wild. Modern archaeology reveals almost the opposite story. At the height of occupation, many of these locations were not deep forest in anything resembling their present form. Plazas were cleared. Residential zones were occupied continuously. Fields extended across nearby terrain. Orchards and useful trees were managed. Hillsides were terraced. Wetlands were modified. Roads crossed low areas. Reservoirs were maintained. Fuel was gathered on an enormous scale. The dense canopy seen today is largely the landscape that develops after population contraction, not necessarily the landscape experienced by people living in the great cities. This distinction changes the meaning of every photograph showing a pyramid rising above green trees. The forest is not simply the backdrop of Maya civilization. In many places, it is part of what came afterward. Ecological recovery begins as human pressure declines. Areas formerly cultivated are colonized by secondary vegetation. Over generations, tree communities become taller and more complex. Animal populations move into abandoned settlement zones. Soil accumulates over floors and causeways. What had been an intensively managed mosaic gradually acquires the appearance of continuous woodland. Yet hidden beneath that woodland remain agricultural terraces, field boundaries, artificial depressions, walls, and roads preserving an earlier arrangement of space. One of the most surprising implications is that apparently untouched tropical landscapes can contain deep histories of human modification. The concept of pristine wilderness becomes difficult to apply. Forests may recover biologically while still carrying traces of earlier settlement in their soils. Species distributions and topography. Certain useful tree species can remain unusually common near ancient Maya sites. Although scholars still debate how strongly modern forest composition reflects ancient management rather than later ecological processes, the evidence remains incomplete. But the broader lesson is clear: a forest can look natural while resting on centuries of human engineering. The disappearance of architecture beneath vegetation also affects memory. Major ruins that remain visible or locally important can retain names, stories, and sacred associations. Smaller settlements may gradually lose recognizable identity. A family compound becomes a mound without a name. A neighborhood becomes uneven ground. A causeway becomes a ridge crossed by hunters. When political systems disappear and populations shift, the landscape preserves structures longer than society preserves knowledge of who built every one of them. Yet the Maya world never becomes entirely silent. Communities continue living throughout the region. People farm near ancient ruins, travel past old monuments, reuse stone, visit sacred places, and preserve traditions connecting them to earlier landscapes. The idea that every city was completely forgotten is another simplification. Some sites certainly faded from wider knowledge, especially beyond local communities, but others remained physically and culturally present. The forest creates a different kind of forgetting, not total absence, but reduced visibility. It makes the scale difficult to comprehend. One exposed temple can be understood as a ruin. 10,000 house platforms beneath trees cannot be understood from ground level at all. A traveller sees vegetation where an ancient resident would have seen neighbourhoods. Archaeologists excavating one structure may understand that structure perfectly while still missing the regional network surrounding it. This is why the later arrival of aerial photography, satellite imagery, and eventually LiDAR becomes so transformative. The technologies do not resurrect lost cities from nothing. They reverse the forest's visual deception. By looking downward across enormous areas, researchers can see patterns that the canopy has fragmented for centuries. Roads line up again, Residential districts reconnect. Defensive walls regain their full length. Reservoirs reappear as parts of urban systems rather than isolated depressions. And yet the recovering forest carries a warning of its own. Landscapes can preserve civilizations while erasing the appearance that those civilizations ever existed. Human dominance can feel permanent from inside a crowded city, especially when temples, roads, markets, reservoirs, and political traditions have existed for generations. But once maintenance stops, the physical distinction between city and nature can weaken with startling speed. A stone platform becomes soil, a palace becomes habitat, a reservoir becomes a wet depression visited by animals, a ceremonial road becomes a barely visible rise beneath roots. The Maya cities never truly disappear. They change category. Architecture becomes terrain, infrastructure becomes geology to the untrained eye, and human history becomes embedded inside forest ecology. That is why the greatest discovery of the hidden Maya landscape is not any single pyramid or newly mapped road. It is the realization that beneath the modern canopy lies the outline of an entire inhabited world. And even now, after decades of excavation and years of laser mapping, only part of that world has been brought back into view. The forest still holds more than any map can comfortably contain. Every new survey of the Maya lowlands seems to replace one set of blank spaces with another set of questions. A previously unknown residential cluster appears beneath the trees. A causeway extends farther than expected. A hill thought to be natural proves to contain architecture. Agricultural modifications spread across terrain once considered marginal. Defensive lines appear around settlements whose political histories are barely understood. The remarkable transformation of Maya archaeology is therefore not that the mystery has been solved. It is that researchers are finally beginning to see the true size of the mystery. LIDAR has accelerated that process dramatically, but the technology is only the beginning. A digital image can identify a mound, yet it cannot tell who lived there. It can reveal a reservoir, but not whether the people maintaining it experienced abundance or fear during the final dry season before abandonment. It can trace a causeway through kilometers of forest, without explaining whether merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, farmers, or royal messengers used it most often. Those answers still depend on people entering the landscape, cutting narrow trails, examining ceramics, excavating floors, collecting botanical remains, studying sediments, dating charcoal, and comparing countless small discoveries. In this sense, modern archaeology is moving in two directions at once. Remote sensing makes the Maya world larger, while excavation makes it more human. One technology reveals thousands of structures simultaneously. The other pauses inside a single household and reconstructs meals, tools, burials, repairs, and generations of occupation. Neither view is sufficient alone. Some of the most important future discoveries may not involve spectacular temples at all. A sequence of agricultural soils could reveal how farmers responded to drought. Sediments in a reservoir might preserve evidence of declining rainfall or contamination. Chemical traces in an ancient marketplace could identify activities that left no visible architecture. Human remains can reveal diet, migration, disease, and patterns of violence. Ancient environmental DNA and increasingly precise dating methods may eventually expose changes that archaeologists currently see only as broad, centuries-long transitions. The unanswered questions are enormous. How centralized were some of the early pre-classic networks now visible beneath northern Guatemala? Were particular causeway systems controlled by powerful centers? Or did they emerge through cooperation among multiple communities? How many people actually occupied the densest regions at their peak? Which agricultural techniques provided the greatest share of their food? How often did ordinary households move when political boundaries shifted? Scholars still debate these issues, and the evidence remains incomplete. Even the famous collapse becomes more complicated as the archaeological map improves. What once looked like a broad disappearance can increasingly be examined neighborhood by neighborhood. Some places empty quickly, others contract gradually. Certain regions gain population as neighboring ones decline. One royal dynasty disappears while nearby communities continue. The old desire to find a single explanation becomes harder to sustain as more local histories emerge. This may ultimately be one of the greatest contributions of the hidden landscape. It forces archaeology away from a civilization-wide story of simple rise and fall, and towards something closer to reality, thousands of communities making different decisions under changing conditions. The Maya themselves were never a single political people marching through one unified history. Their world contained numerous languages, kingdoms, local identities, rival dynasties, economic networks, and regional traditions. They shared important cultural frameworks, but they also fought one another, competed for prestige, developed distinct political strategies, and responded differently to environmental stress. The forest buried this complexity beneath a deceptively uniform canopy. From above, every abandoned city becomes the same shade of green. Modern archaeology is slowly restoring the differences. And the work carries another responsibility. Ancient Maya sites are not merely abandoned remnants belonging to a vanished population. They form part of the heritage of living Maya communities whose ancestors endured political collapse, migration, conquest, colonial rule, epidemics, religious suppression, land dispossession, and modern violence. The language of a lost civilization can therefore mislead if it implies that the people themselves disappeared. They did not. Millions of Maya people live throughout Central America and beyond. Maya languages remain spoken. Agricultural knowledge, community traditions, ritual practices, artistic forms, and historical identities persist, transformed by centuries but not erased. The ancient ruins are separated from the present by tremendous change, yet they are not the remains of an extinct humanity. That continuity makes the landscape more powerful. The temples beneath the forest are not evidence of a people who mysteriously vanished from Earth. They are evidence that political systems can disappear while populations adapt, move, survive, and rebuild their worlds in different forms. There is also a practical urgency to studying what remains. Deforestation, agricultural expansion, looting, road construction, fire, and development threaten archaeological landscapes throughout parts of Central America. A site protected by forest for centuries can be damaged quickly once heavy machinery reaches it. Looters can cut trenches into buildings and tombs, destroying information that no later technology can reconstruct. LiDAR may reveal where features exist, but mapping something does not guarantee its survival. At the same time, conservation cannot simply treat the forest as a museum emptied of people. Modern communities depend on the same landscapes for livelihoods. Archaeology, environmental protection, indigenous rights, local knowledge, and sustainable development increasingly intersect. The ancient Maya story itself demonstrates why treating people and environment as separate problems is misleading. They have always been connected. Perhaps that is why the newly visible Maya landscape feels so contemporary. Beneath the trees is evidence of cities confronting familiar challenges, feeding dense populations, securing water, maintaining infrastructure, managing inequality, negotiating political rivalry, coping with climatic uncertainty, and deciding how much pressure an environment can absorb. Their solutions are ancient, but the underlying problems are not. Still, caution is necessary. The Maya past should not be converted into a simple warning about modern civilization. Ancient societies operated under different technologies, political institutions, climates, economies, and cultural assumptions. History does not repeat itself according to a convenient script. What it offers instead is evidence of how complex systems behave when several kinds of stress interact. The Maya world demonstrates extraordinary resilience before it demonstrates disruption. Cities flourish for centuries in difficult environments. Farmers develop sophisticated methods for using diverse landscapes. Engineers capture seasonal rainfall. Traders connect distant ecological zones. Scribes preserve complex histories. Builders create architecture capable of surviving more than 1,000 years beneath tropical forest. Political systems repeatedly recover from war and dynastic crisis. That long success makes the later transformations more meaningful, not less. The final image produced by modern archaeology is therefore neither a paradise destroyed by environmental ignorance, nor a mysterious empire suddenly erased by catastrophe. It is a vast, changing human landscape. It expands, reorganizes, struggles, fragments, and survives. And somewhere beyond the edges of the latest laser survey, beneath another unbroken stretch of green canopy, there are almost certainly more foundations waiting to alter the story again. The forest is quiet now in places where thousands of footsteps once crossed plastered plazas. Rain falls on temple summits that once carried painted buildings. Water gathers inside depressions shaped by hands that know record names. Roots pass slowly through walls built by workers whose descendants could never have imagined aircraft measuring the ground with invisible pulses of light. From the canopy, nothing about these places appears unfinished. The trees do not distinguish between palace and house, between royal tomb and abandoned field. Leaves settle on everything equally. Seasons pass, stone fractures, soil deepens. The landscape folds human ambition back into itself. Yet beneath that surface, the old world remains remarkably persistent. A slight ridge can still be a road, a shallow basin can still remember a reservoir, a hill can contain generations of temples built one over another, a patch of forest can preserve the foundations of families who cooked, worked, argued, celebrated, mourned, and watched the same rainy seasons arrive centuries before the cities around them fell silent. Civilizations rarely disappear in the clean way stories prefer. Buildings outlast governments, languages outlast kings. People move while monuments remain. Memories change shape. Landscapes conceal what they cannot entirely erase. The ancient Maya lowlands make that truth visible with unusual force because the disguise is so complete. A visitor sees forest, yet beneath the roots lie roads. The eye sees wilderness, while instruments reveal neighborhoods. What looks empty turns out to have been crowded. What looks timeless turns out to be the result of change. Perhaps centuries from now, other landscapes will carry the same confusion. Roads will become lines beneath vegetation. Foundations will lose their names. Places that once seemed permanent will require archaeology to be understood at all. For the Maya cities beneath Central America, that transformation has already happened. Their towers have become green hills, their avenues have become forest floor, and their engineered world has slipped beneath a living canopy. But it has not disappeared. It waits in stone, soil, pollen, water, language, and memory, quietly reminding anyone willing to look closely enough that beneath a landscape that seems eternal, another world can still be there,